All right, well, we got quite a bit of content to get through today, so why don't we go ahead and get started, Michael? Um, Today, we wanted to introduce to you a story from Jamf and Wandera, specifically focusing on how we manage risk in the modern workplace between both Jamf and Wandera solutions. Presenting today are myself. I'm Nick Amundsen. I lead our strategy team here at Jamf. And we've got Michael Covington joining us from the Wandera team, who's the VP of strategy from Wandera. And the agenda, just to kind of go over this at a high level, we're going to do just a quick overview of Jamf and kind of what we've been up to over the last couple of years and how we see Wandera fitting into the picture. We're going to talk about the problem space in general, again, kind of that hybrid work subject, as well as how that applies to the modern workplace. We're going to talk about some mobile risks and challenges, and then we're going to highlight some solutions we've got for really modernizing your security strategy in this new world. So those are kind of the main topical areas we'll cover. Like I said, lots of content to get through here today. So starting with Jamf, for those of you who may not be familiar with Jamf, our whole mission and vision is that we help organizations succeed with Apple. But we realize that Apple exists within an ecosystem, and that's something we're going to be talking about quite a bit here today. What we've really been on the mission to do over the last couple of years is to really create a space we're calling Apple Enterprise Management. And with that, we need a platform to be able to efficiently deliver a solution for our customers. And so while we've gotten our start in the management space, that's kind of the central box you see on this slide here. Over the last couple of years, we've also been focusing holistically on what's needed to be able to complete an Apple Enterprise Management platform within an organization. So importantly, beyond just managing devices, users have to connect to resources. And on Apple devices, users expect that experience to be a certain caliber. And we help deliver that experience. Increasingly with security being a focus within organizations and being a potential for attackers to focus on, we protect devices, data, and privacy on those devices. And as you'll hear today, Wandera really helps us complete that solution and bring a holistic approach to how we can modernize your security stack. So we'll be talking about that specifically today and how it really fits into this concept of Apple Enterprise Management. Along the bottom there, you kind of see several capabilities that we've got either in products we've built from the ground up or products we've acquired over the last couple of years, but really key capabilities we see as part of the Apple Enterprise Management platform. Anything from zero-touch deployment to app lifecycle management, also known as patch, all the way to APIs and automation and some things we're doing specifically in industries to be able to address their workflows that they have in settings like healthcare and retail. We also believe, importantly, part of the Apple Enterprise Management platform is granting you visibility and analytics to what's happening across these various products that make up this platform. And then, like I said, providing that high caliber end user experience that Apple users know and love. And in some cases, this means us getting out of the way and presenting an Apple experience wherever we can. So we'll move to the next slide and just some high-level stats about Jamf. We manage over 50,000 organizations today, managing a total of over 20 million Apple devices across a number of different customers we've got. And just some high-level stats as it applies to industries. So 23 of the 25 most valuable brands rely on Jamf. We've got 8 of 10 of the largest companies out there, 7 of those 10 that are tech companies, and then 10 out of 10 of the largest US banks that are using Jamf as a solution. So we've been around for several years at this point, really focused on that management space, but really trying to broaden that and ensure that as many organizations as possible can get access to the Jamf solution to be able to help grow Apple devices within their organization. From here, I'll turn it over to Michael, and we'll talk a little bit more about the modern workplace and some of the problems we see in that space.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, I think that a lot of businesses are really excited about the investments that they've made in digital transformation so that they can empower their workers with this whole concept of a modern workplace. Essentially, the ability to choose the devices that help them be the most productive, to work from the places and the facilities where they feel the most comfortable and that they're at their best. And I think a big part of the modernization of the workplace has come about as a result of this whole concept of the enterprise perimeter really coming down. People aren't held tethered to their desks anymore. They're able to go out roaming around the campus. And more importantly, they're able to work away from the enterprise facility. And I think a big component that led to this happening was the adoption of mobility. Mobile devices, mobile services. We know that over the last decade, remote work has quadrupled. And as a result of the recent pandemic and a lot of the work from home orders we've seen worldwide, it's not just workers who are on the road for a single business trip. It's people who are working out of the corporate campus for the majority of their work weeks. And so not only do you have individuals that are outside of the campus, but you've got enterprise data that obviously now has to leave that perimeter as well. 70% of workers don't sit behind a desk anymore. More than half of internet traffic is associated with a mobile device. Mobility is having a big, big impact on enterprise today. And it's not just the workers and their devices that have left the company campus, it's applications as well. We know that over the last few years, specifically, we're close to about 85% now of workloads and applications being out of the data center and now in cloud hosting facilities. This doesn't mean that all organizations are now 100% in the cloud, but they are making a pretty significant transition to kind of getting those applications off of their premises and into the cloud. And as a result, a lot of them are really now struggling with this whole concept of remote access. It used to be you could provide a worker who wasn't on campus with a thing called a VPN. And that VPN would essentially allow that worker to pretend as though they were sitting on the company network, access all the same applications and data that reside on that company physical network infrastructure. You can't do that anymore now that all these apps have left that company campus. And on top of that, organizations really are looking to evolve how they secure their infrastructure, their workers, and really this whole concept of remote access, they know it needs to change. You can't just let a remote worker look and feel as though they're on the physical network when they're not. It also is problematic to put too much trust in people who sit on that network. And so organizations are really now starting to explore this concept of zero trust. What does it mean to have no trust in your workers and their devices until they ask for access to an application, and you build that trust up as you assess the individual, the devices they're on, et cetera. We'll talk about that at length as we get through today's presentation. Verizon recently partnered with vendors like Wandera to put together something that they put out annually called the Mobile Security Index. It's a combination of survey data as well as industry data on kind of the state of the state as it pertains to mobile and mobile work. And a couple of results that I thought were really quite interesting to kick off our conversation today looked at what happened over the last year as more and more employees worked from home. We saw that about 79% of organizations had remote working increase. I think that's not a surprise for many. The share of remote work really doubled during the pandemic. It wasn't just a select group of workers that were staying home. It was just about every group or organizational unit had some individuals from the team that were no longer able to make it to the company campus. And there's this whole notion of the concept of remote work, mobile work, really disappearing from the vernacular in the next 5 years, just because it's going to just be work. It's just the way that people are doing the things that they need to do to be productive. This concept of hybrid work is one that's really taking off, and we'll talk about it throughout today's presentation, where sometimes people are mobile, sitting at home. Sometimes they're sitting in a coffee shop getting work done. Sometimes they're in the company campus. And as we think of this, this worker who is kind of constantly in flux, transitioning from one physical setting to another, what we want to do is make it so that they can be as productive as possible without having to think about how that context changes what they do on their devices. You don't want them to have to launch a VPN in some scenarios and not launch a VPN in others. You don't want to take certain risks in one scenario that you aren't willing to take in others. And so it's really rethinking your whole security strategy. And I think that's something that we'll definitely address towards the end is how does this really start to influence what organizations do from this point forward to really get comfortable with this notion of hybrid work and workers who have access to all data, all applications, wherever they are, and on whatever kind of device the business feels is appropriate for them. The Mobile Security Index also really looked at how critical mobility has become to business. We saw that about 71% of respondents, when asked to rate how crucial mobile was to their business, 71% responded with an 8+ out of 10. So very, very high acknowledgement that mobile is now core. But on the flip side, about 40% of respondents now think that mobile devices are the company's biggest IT security threat. And I think it's not a surprise, probably for many of you on the call here today, in that mobile has often been overlooked. I think that there was an assumption early on that mobile had this kind of new operating system, this new approach to app delivery, this sandboxed model that was built in from the ground up, and people assumed these platforms were secure. As you'll see from some of the data that we'll walk through today, that's not the case. And we'll kind of talk you through the different areas where security has become an issue for businesses and how those security issues are preventing people from being productive. You see the last stat here, 97% of security leaders considering remote work to be more exposed to risk than those who are not remote. Well, as this concept of hybrid work becomes the norm, this is going to be everybody. This is going to be every worker in the organization that now is at some increased level of risk than they were at before. And that's not something we need to roll back. I think it's really important that everybody here just acknowledge that this is something that's just the new normal, and we need to make sure that our security tools and connectivity tools just help us deal with this increased risk so that it's a measured risk and we have the ability to mitigate any issues that may come up along the way that the user might encounter. And I think with that, let me transition now into talking specifically about these specific risks and categories of risk that we see really facing hybrid workers and businesses that want to support a mobile workforce. There's really 4 key categories from our perspective. There's the users that are actually connecting through devices to applications to be productive. They're the devices that they utilize to really stay connected while on the go. There are the apps and the applications. These are both the pieces of software that sit on the device, as well as the data and applications that sit out on the internet that users are connecting to when they're remote. And then, of course, there's the networks that they connect across. One of the things we have to remember as we talk about hybrid work is that most of the infrastructure the workers are going to be utilizing is not company-owned and maintained. So as you look across all of these different categories, there's a lot of opportunity here for disruption, for theft of data, for denial of service. And what we really want to do is just make sure that everyone really fully understands these different categories and you start to think through what your mitigation strategy will be as these risks start to become encountered more and more by your workforce. So I think what we'll do is we'll start with user risk. And user risk is really interesting. When we talk about workers, whether they are physically sitting in a company campus, connected to the locally owned infrastructure, or they're out on the road using Wi-Fi or cellular connectivity, there's really 2 key attack vectors that we need to be mindful of. The first is the outside-in attack. And this is something that I think when we talk about security, everybody's familiar with. You're familiar with the attacker who doesn't belong to your organization, who is trying to infiltrate and get some information from your employees. One of the things that you'll hear several times in this presentation is how vulnerable organizations are to social engineering and phishing in particular, especially when it comes to mobile devices. We see here the stat that remote workers were 26 times more likely to be phished than to encounter malware. This is a staggering stat if you put this into perspective and you look across your organization. And it really does go to show no matter how good your devices and networks and applications are in terms of security, how hardened you've made them, your workers are always going to be the weakest link. And because of the way these attacks are coming across, they look very, very good. They're very well crafted. And so workers are really likely to be hammered at here. The other kind of flip side to this is looking at the risk that users themselves introduce through their own usage. We see here 600%, a 6-fold increase in the number of visits to sites hosting adult content just over the last year. Workers, as they're not sitting in desks with other colleagues looking over their shoulders, have shown that they're more inclined to access not just adult, but gaming, gambling, extreme types of content that would have been deemed inappropriate in many workplaces. They're now accessing quite freely on their mobile and their hybrid devices when they're not in the office. And what we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about what some of this behavior is really emphasizing or showcasing with these workers. But let me start by just a closer look at phishing. I think everybody is familiar with the concept of phishing, an attacker who is trying to compromise a worker's credentials so that the attacker can essentially take over a work account. In the past, what we had seen is that much of the phishing activity that was out there was really targeting individuals as consumers. And so what we saw were a lot of consumer banks that tended to make their way to the top 10 lists of phishing brands and sites that were being used. What our data shows is just over the last year, we're seeing a lot more impersonated brands that relate to businesses. We're seeing the attackers going after critical single sign-on credentials, whether they be from Microsoft or Google or Apple. Really, those big three tech giants are the ones that many of the attacks are being kind of tailored to. We're also seeing still a lot of government attacks and opportunistic attacks, where we're seeing the attackers take advantage of current day scenarios because they know that people are searching for certain types of data, and they want to use those search queries to push a phishing attack to pull the victim in towards them and get those corporate credentials. One good example here is what happened over the last year with the coronavirus. We saw a very significant spike in terms and brands that were being used to launch phishing attacks that were related to COVID-19. This plot that you see right here is Wandera analysis of phishing events just from the November 19 to November 2020 period. So essentially the first about 9 months or so of the coronavirus pandemic. And we saw an elevated run of COVID-19 related terms, and then a number of big spikes that were related to very specific campaigns that these attackers were using to basically impersonate the World Health Organization, the CDC, specific local governments to really take advantage of this situation that was of great interest that people were looking for information on, and then they would fall on the heels of it with fake information as well as phishing attacks. Also, as I alluded to in that kind of introduction to user risk, we did see a big spike in users who were previously quite cautious about the types of extreme content that they would access on work computers, really relaxing some of those, I guess, restraints that they were showing previously. Lots of inappropriate use, lots of acceptable use policies being violated. And we won't have a lot of time today to go into acceptable use policies, but just about every organization has had acceptable use or AUP policies defined for desktops and laptops that were used in the corporate campus. Many failed to transition those AUP policies to include mobile. And I think coming out of the pandemic, seeing data like this, we're seeing a lot of organizations now sit down, go back to the drawing board, engage with their user community, and make sure that they put appropriate use policies in place that they can not only monitor, but also enforce moving forward as well. I'll transition now from users to applications. This is our second threat category that we want to take a closer look at. When we talk about application risk or app risk specifically on mobile devices, many people specifically will start to think about malware. And there are certainly malicious incidents that we've seen in all of the leading app stores. We saw that over the last year, as a result of people just trying to cope with this new kind of modern reality of working from home, about a third of organizations relaxed restrictions on app use just because people stopped being productive. People stopped feeling like they had access to the tools that they needed to get their jobs done. So companies took away some of the policies that were in place so people could install applications. This introduced a lot of application-oriented risk that went beyond malware to these organizations. Some examples of application risk that is not just malware. You've got vulnerable applications, those applications that may have had a vulnerability identified and maybe even patched by the developer, but not updated by the user. You have applications that leak sensitive data or fail to encrypt it when they're sending it to the back-end service. Wandera recently did a really extensive analysis of app permissions. We looked across both iOS as well as Android, looked at every category of apps that the various app stores offer, and we looked at the permissions that were being requested, the types of data that these applications wanted to get access to. Really interesting analysis here, I think. And this is one that I think is worth every organization taking a close look at, and just making sure that the applications that you are allowing into your workplace, onto devices that have customer, employee, and partner data on it, are aligned with your acceptable use policies. Your AUPs should not just be about the types of websites that you're allowed to go to. It should also be inclusive of the types of applications that individuals are installing on their devices. I think all too often we think of these app permissions as protecting end user data. That is absolutely correct. But there's also critical enterprise data that could be obtained if these permissions are taken advantage of. There's a lot of apps that I've seen that have camera access or microphone access turned on and used in environments where the employer has very clearly stated no cameras, no recording devices. And so connecting the dots between those written policies and the types of things are being brought in through mobile devices is key for organizations that are really wanting to implement this modern workplace. So I've talked about user risk. I've talked about app risk. Now let me talk about the category that's probably the most familiar to many of you on the call, and that's device-oriented risk. It's no surprise that devices are, in many cases, the gateway to business applications, and so you want to make sure that they're secure. Some interesting stats that came out of the Mobile Security Index that I thought were worth just putting on the table for today. One is that more than half of US workers have allowed friends or family to use work devices. Interesting. I'm not sure that every employer thinks about the implications of non-employees utilizing those work devices and what access those individuals who are not connected to the company might have. The second stat here is also really interesting. More than a quarter of corporate devices are using a known vulnerable operating system. One where the vulnerabilities and the exploits are active, they're known, and there's a patch available. Individuals in many cases are still responsible for hitting the update button, I approve. And if you don't have a way of encouraging your workers to get those operating systems in a secure state, and that firm foundation, you're really putting everything that's built up on top of that foundation at risk. So you could have the most secure apps and the most secure networks, but if your operating system itself is vulnerable, everything that's going to be built on top is going to crumble. And then there's also a lot of things that we could talk about regarding good device hygiene and security posture. One stat that I'll just throw out here is that only about a third of companies today report using whole disk encryption on laptops. We see very similar behavior on mobile devices, not requiring the latest operating system, not monitoring the profiles that are installed on the device, or really having any policies at all if the device is jailbroken or rooted. So lots of things to think about as you think of overall device hygiene.
Michael, just to drop in on that slide for a second. Even if an organization is not supplying a device these days, users are bringing their own device to work, right? And in some circumstances, you may unknowingly be getting some of your organization's information into a state where it could be accessed by family or friends. So this is why this is just such an increasingly important topic that, like we've said, mobile is here to stay. And there's a number of different ways where a document or something that's corporate information could get onto a device that you may not expect, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point. We teased a little bit at the beginning with referencing zero trust, and the whole concept of zero trust is to bring together all of the different checks that you might want to put in place at the time sensitive data is being accessed, whether it's on the device or across the network. And so in your scenario with BYOD, you want to make sure that you verify that the authenticator, the user that you want is actually sitting at that device at the right time. The device hasn't been compromised since the last time you ran a check. And you want to do all that right then when that sensitive data is being accessed. I think it's a great scenario with BYOD specifically to raise there. As we move on and we talk about the networks now that these devices are attaching to, one of the really interesting stats that I saw is that more than half of organizations who experienced a compromise through mobile attributed at least in part to network-oriented risk. Essentially, a network that the device attached to that the organization didn't trust. And when that happens, you've got a situation where we essentially, in the industry, we call this a man-in-the-middle attack, where some infrastructure is pretending to be trusted. The traffic that passes through that man-in-the-middle can be tampered with. It can be spied on. And so there's a significant amount of risk that I don't think a lot of organizations have quite grasped as they allow people to connect to non-company-owned infrastructure. And by no means do I want to suggest that you can only use your devices in the workplace where the company owns and operates the network. But I think you do want to think about the guidance that you give your workers to help them make good decisions on which networks are acceptable and which aren't. What are some of the key indicators that they maybe want to look for? And maybe as a IT organization, what kind of tools should you have in your kit bag so that you can offer it to specific workers or for specific applications to ensure that that data is going to be protected as it's going through any infrastructure, whether you trust it, you don't, or maybe you're just uncertain. So I think that there's a lot of shades of gray when it comes to network infrastructure that businesses really need to start to get a handle on here. Of course, over the last year, you are going to see some data that man-in-the-middle attacks were down. That absolutely is true because people just weren't using public Wi-Fi. As people go on the road, as they start to travel more, we are absolutely going to see this start to ramp back up. I can show you the graph here is looking at all of 2020. As I look at the first 6 months of 2021, I'm already seeing this line start to make an upward curve. So lockdowns are ending, and I think we're starting to see the increased return of man-in-the-middle attacks. In the limited amount of time that we've got remaining, what I thought we might do very quickly is just talk about modernizing security strategy, really starting to think about what it means with all of this information about these new threat vectors that impact hybrid work. How do we want to start to put together a strategy that helps people get connected to the applications that allow them to be productive, but also make sure that we get the right security checks in place? And I think Nick's example of the BYOD scenario is a really good one to keep in mind here, and right next to a corporate-owned device scenario, because you will see how, essentially, as I build out these slides, there are knobs that are available for you to turn so that you can fine-tune your strategy, your policies, so that it works just right for each and every individual worker or class of worker or organizational unit that you've got. Essentially, what we're talking about here as we look at this visual is workers who are trying to get work done. Doesn't matter from where. We want to make sure that they're empowered to work from anywhere. Work is done with applications and data. So staying connected is key. One of the things that we've always thought about in the past is making sure that workers had devices that we trusted to allow them to connect to sensitive applications. In the past, most organizations were laser focused on desktops and laptops. They didn't really think about how mobility, whether it was an iPhone or an iPad, how those devices were protected. And so really making sure that we've got this very clear concept of what a sanctioned device is, whether it's a managed device or some form of BYOD with perhaps application management policies in place. We also want to make sure that we're looking at who the user is. Identity is an increasingly important component of how we define security policies, and not knowing who the worker is getting to be almost unacceptable. We can't just have devices authorized to access applications. You really need to make sure you understand who the worker is, or at least the worker role, to ensure that the access is in line with the authorization policy that you've put in place. We then want to think about making sure that the device isn't just sanctioned, but that it's free of threat, and that all of the other connections from that device are in compliance with the regulations, the acceptable use policies that the organization has defined. Really, really key as you start to think of this as a set of kind of really layers connecting your workers to applications. You've got the devices that they connect to, the users themselves and the roles that they assume within the organization, the threats that could impact them, whether it's phishing or the devices like malware, and then, of course, all the policies that come around with usage analytics. We don't have time today to talk at length about the Wandera services that recently joined the Jamf family, but I did want to just give a bird's eye view on kind of how we think of the world, the way we've structured our approach to providing protections for organizations that are really embracing this new way to work. We are a cloud-delivered security solution, and through the cloud, we have three kind of key pillars of functionality that really look end-to-end from the device to the applications in providing the services that organizations need to get comfortable allowing hybrid workers to connect to their business tools. I'll walk through these very quickly. First, we have a mobile threat defense offering that is security capabilities that reside both on the device as well as in the network that provides security hygiene all the way up through anti-phishing and application intelligence. We do have support for any mobile device, whether it's managed or unmanaged. So you can really start to think about getting a consistent baseline across all of your hybrid workers with the approach that we've taken here with mobile threat defense. We have a service called Data Policy. Think of this as a secure web gateway for workers who are outside of the corporate perimeter. So with this tool, you get content filtering as well as usage controls. That means you can solve a whole bunch of different use cases, whether it be saving costs on how cellular data is utilized, filtering content based on categories. You can do things like preventing access to adult content or gaming content, and you can even do it, use it to do shadow IT discovery. Very, very flexible policy controls here in that you can define policies by user, by group, or by organization. So there's a very clear tie-in here with the identities that are included in your device management suite or in your identity provider. And last but not least, we have a zero trust network access solution. This is essentially fast and secure connections to any business application, whether they're in the cloud or they're on-prem. We provide real-time risk assessments so that you actually can implement true zero trust policies. And we do support all modern operating systems here. So this goes beyond mobile. The important thing here is that you can provide a consistent layer of connectivity to any app from any device, iOS, macOS, Android, Win 10, and we do not require device management for this solution to be implemented. So something that you can make available not only to employees, but to contractors and folks that might be using someone else's device to access business applications. Wandera fits in, I think, with a lot of different enterprise IT tools. We work really, really well with device deployments, device management. So no matter what your device management tool of choice is, we've got some integrations there to streamline deployments and activations. From a security SecOps workflow perspective, we do tie in with just about every SecOps tool that you might have, whether it be a SIEM, a SOAR, an EPP, or an EDR platform. We also implement with CASBs, like Microsoft's Cloud Application Security Broker. So lots of really cool options there for how you would want to kind of embed this platform to not only provide protections to your remote workers, but also incorporate that data and policy response in with the other tools that you're currently working with within your team. Nick, maybe I should turn it back to you to talk about a bit of the road ahead here with Jamf and Wandera.
Sounds great. Thank you, Michael. Hopefully throughout the presentation, you've kind of just seen some of those synergies that would exist between Jamf and Wandera. And it's early days in terms of our, our partnership together. But some of the things we're going to be focused on, of course, continuing to provide comprehensive management. And on that note, continuing to support Apple devices with the operating systems they have on them the same time that Apple releases those operating systems. It's one of the tenets that we value quite a bit here at Jamf. We know you as customers value that as well. We're going to continue to meet that demand. We're going to continue to focus on end-to-end security. And in the context of Wandera, that means not only security on the device, of course, but security at that network level, which is becoming increasingly blurry. As Michael kind of talked through all the different environments where a user can be connecting these days, we want to ensure that end-to-end security as much as possible. Really important too is seamless productivity. No matter where the worker is connecting from, we're providing that seamless experience, consistent experience on that device to ensure that they can get their work done and be as productive as possible. As I alluded to earlier, we really know that Apple users value a really great end user experience. And so we need to make our solutions really intuitive, really easy to use. And that's also something we'll be continuing to focus on. And then that last theme there, privacy aware, privacy preserving. Jamf really is in lockstep with Apple with regards to the way that we value a user's privacy and the way that we want to find that balance between security and privacy within a corporate setting. So just a little bit of a glimpse into what we've got coming up here, and you'll hear much more from Jamf and Wandera in the coming weeks. At this point, that concludes our formal webinar. So we'll go ahead and open it up for some questions, and we'll see what has come across the chat so far here. So Michael, I've got one here that might be good for you to take. I got a question that says, is Wandera private access a VPN?
Yeah, it's a good question, and sadly we didn't have time to go into detail, but I'll give you the really quick bullet point response here. So it is not a VPN. You can think of it as a modern approach to remote access or VPN replacement. It does formally fall in the category that Gartner's calling Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA. And I think the fundamental differences here are that it is rooted in identity. So we do provide integrations with all the leading identity providers, or IDPs. That means that the user bootstraps the service by simply using their existing business single sign-on credentials. And from that point forward, they're going to have access to the applications that the business has defined. We do not provide a single pipe to a remote network like a VPN does. What we do is we use these very fast microtunnels, which are implemented per application. And so what that means is that those security policies that you define for each and every individual application are evaluated every time the user makes that connection and ongoing throughout the course of that connection. If anything should change, like the user's risk state, the risk assessment of their endpoint, you can use that to snap one of those individual microtunnels. And that really helps to make sure that your business applications are protected. One of the things that a lot of people, I think, don't realize as they start to implement ZTNA solutions is that you can use ZTNA for connectivity to all of your applications, not just those that sit in the data center. You can use the same technology to provide connectivity to apps that might be in public cloud, like AWS or GCP, as well as SaaS applications. You can really enhance the security of SaaS applications with a ZTNA solution like Wandera Private Access. So lots more that we could talk about there, but hopefully that's enough additional color to help you understand how this compares to a VPN.
Excellent. I'll try to tackle the next one here. So we've got some questions on how these solutions are packaged. Speaking to the Wandera side, it's price per user, and very similar to some of the visuals that Michael provided. There's mobile threat defense, there's data policy, there's a security suite, and then there's ZTNA. So you can kind of think of those as all separate offerings from Wandera, price per user. And then when it comes to Jamf, we price by user or by device, depending on what your preference is. And we've got, so from a management perspective, we've got Jamf Now, which is really geared towards small and medium businesses with a limited set of functionality, but very focused on workflows. And then we've got Jamf Pro, which is really the comprehensive management solution that's very extensible, integrates with a number of solutions within a enterprise ecosystem. And those are kind of our two core offerings when it comes to management. And then we've got our Jamf Connect product line, which helps users connect to devices in an Apple ecosystem and really keep things in sync with an identity provider like Google or Azure or Ping or whatever identity provider you're using within your organization. And then we've got Jamf Protect, which really focuses on security on the endpoint itself. So when it comes to securing a Mac within the organization and ensuring that the threat vector of the Mac is kept at bay, that's really the Jamf Protect functionality. So that is kind of how the solutions are packaged together today. Maybe we'll take one more question here. There's one about content filtering here, Michael. So is Wandera's content filtering performed on the device?
That's a good question. I think a lot of times people think that because we deploy an app, that the app is doing all the filtering on the device. I can tell you that we actually have a number of different ways of implementing our content filtering solution. I mentioned Web Gateway earlier. We also have sanitized DNS and a few other technologies that we can bring to bear, whether you're protecting a BYOD device or a corporate liable device, lots of different knobs, as I mentioned earlier. But all of that blocking is actually done at the network layer, which means that we're not limited with the intelligence or the threat intelligence that we use. It means that we can categorize the internet. Every day we run essentially bots that go out and look at new websites that are registered, evaluate the content, determine the category. And we do use category-based rules for our content filtering. So we've got, in total, I think about 130 different categories and subcategories that you can use to define the blocking. And it's important to emphasize that we're not just blocking based on web application, meaning the URL, but also mobile app. So we've really brought together the categories that these two entities reside in and allowed us to define one core set of policies that sit across both. And you can customize it. So Wandera does have a custom allow and block list where you can go in and input your own intelligence, domain names, IPs, URIs, et cetera, and use that for blocking. So hopefully that helps clarify where those policies are implemented.
Awesome. And just looking at the clock, looks like we're at time today, but there's a lot more information out there. And if you're interested in taking the next step, you can either go to the Jamf website, jamf.com, or contact info@jamf.com, and somebody from Jamf or Wandera will be happy to get in touch with you to get you some more information. So I just wanted to say thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully there were some good takeaways there from the information we provided, and we're happy to help you take the next step. Thank you.